Power does not always enter a room loudly. Sometimes it waits by the window and lets careless people reveal the floor beneath them. At 8:17 on a pale Thursday morning, Ravenhill Winter Estate sat 38 miles northwest of Albany in the Catskill frost, its graystone chapel dusted with clean snow and its private lake sealed under glassy ice. The mountain air smelled of pine, cold iron, and expensive wood smoke from the restored carriage house, while a black Cadillac Escalade, 2 Range Rovers, and 1 Mercedes Maybach rolled slowly up the salted drive. Far below, the faint winter lights of the city towers blinked through the valley haze, warmer than the marriage Aurelia Morrow had stopped trying to warm. She noticed everything. Callum Drace stepped out first in a charcoal Brioni suit worth $8,900. His camel overcoat opened just enough for the photographer from his PR team to catch the clean line of his watch, his jaw, his money. Behind him came Odette Fairborn in a cream silk dress under a pale wool cape, smiling at the estate manager as if Ravenhill had been waiting all winter for her approval. Aurelia stepped out last, elegant in a black cashmere coat, burgundy leather gloves, and small gold earrings that caught the weak morning light without asking for it. No one opened her door. The estate tour began at 8:26, exactly 7 minutes behind schedule, and Callum treated those 7 minutes like a market correction. He asked about sight lines, press vans, helicopter noise, restroom access, floral load-in, and whether the old chapel bell could be polished before the ceremony weekend. Odette asked whether the aisle could be widened for her entrance. Callum smiled at her. Aurelia watched the snow collect on the cuffs of his trousers as he praised Odette's natural eye for legacy spaces in front of 12 staff members, 3 planners from Preston Bailey Events, and a young assistant holding a silver iPad with the Drace Holdings crest. The compliment landed softly. The message did not. In the chapel courtyard, where the stones were slick with ice and the wind cut cleanly through the bare maple trees, Callum placed one hand near Odette's lower back without touching her fully, careful enough for cameras, obvious enough for cruelty. He told the estate director that Odette should make the final call on the venue flow because the future should not be arranged around old obligations. The words hung in the frozen air, polished and poisonous. Aurelia did not blink. Across the lake, beyond the estate's black spruce line, a distant high-rise hotel in downtown Albany flashed its rooftop lights through the snow haze, a small electric grid against a white morning. That contrast stayed with Aurelia. City windows glowing with borrowed warmth, mountain stone holding centuries of cold. Callum had built his entire public life the same way, she thought, lit from the outside, hollow at the center. He turned to her only when the estate director mentioned signatures. Aurelia can witness, he said, smooth as marble. Odette lowered her eyes with the practiced modesty of a woman who wanted everyone to notice she had been chosen. Aurelia let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, long enough for the assistant stylist to stop moving. Then she gave one small smile, the kind that made silence feel notarized. The estate director led them into the restored winter conservatory at 9:04, where camellias bloomed under heated glass and brass floor vents breathed dry warmth around their shoes. Outside, snow tapped the panes like fingernails. Inside, crystal water glasses sweated beside a tray of lemon slices no one touched. Callum studied a printed layout marked at $425,000 for 3 days of exclusive use, with an additional $76,000 for weather contingencies and private security. He spoke about the number as if it were a tip. Aurelia studied the margin notes. Heritage classification, preservation escrow, venue priority review pending. Those phrases were not decoration to her. They were doors. Years earlier, before Callum had become the face of magazine profiles and summit panels, Aurelia had built the quiet architecture behind Drace Holdings. Municipal tax abatements, historic site valuations, restricted use land portfolios, and the private analytics system that told billionaires which properties would become untouchable before the market noticed. She had once flagged Ravenhill herself. Callum never remembered that part. Men like him remembered applause. Odette touched the vellum map with one manicured finger and said the chapel should be the emotional center. Callum nodded instantly. Then it settled. Aurelia looked from the map to the iron key hanging in a shadow box beside the conservatory doors, old, black, heavier than it appeared. She felt the wool of her glove tighten over her knuckles, not from anger, but from recognition. Somewhere beneath the estate's polished tour language was a legal seam. Not proof yet, but enough for a woman who had spent 15 years reading power through margins. Callum had brought his mistress here to choose a stage. He had forgotten his wife knew how stages were owned. The snow thickened. Aurelia said nothing. By 10:12, the tour had moved from the winter conservatory into Ravenhill's east reception room, where amber sconces warmed the paneled walls and the snow outside pressed against the tall windows like a silent witness. Callum stood beneath the chandelier with Odette at his side, laughing softly as the event planner projected ceremony diagrams onto a cream wall, each slide turning his face brighter and Aurelia's corner darker. From the upper window, the faint lights of Albany's office towers shimmered through the storm below, tiny squares of gold fighting the blue-gray morning. Aurelia remained still. The split screen of the room was almost cruel in its perfection. Callum smiling under antique light, Odette glowing in champagne silk, while Aurelia stood near the shadowed bookcase with her burgundy gloves folded over one wrist. He pointed at the chapel path, then the conservatory entrance, then the media platform near the frozen lake, turning Betrayal into logistics with the ease of a man who had mistaken manners for permission. Odette asked whether the aisle cameras could be placed low enough to catch the dress movement. Callum chuckled. Aurelia heard the planner's pencil stop against the paper. At 10:19, a junior publicist from Drace Holdings opened a draft press statement on the silver iPad, and every polite smile in the room began to look rehearsed. The headline read, "Drace Holdings announces a new legacy weekend at Ravenhill." Beneath it, Odette was described as the woman beside the future of Drace, while Aurelia had been reduced to a family representative attending in support of continuity. The phrase was clean, expensive, and designed to erase her without leaving fingerprints. Callum looked pleased. Aurelia looked at the numbers instead. $425,000 venue exclusivity, $76,000 weather reserve, $38,500 private security, $14,200 heritage floral compliance, and a pending $11. $6 million preservation escrow tied to Ravenhill's restricted use status. She could smell warm lemon tea, old paper, wet wool, and the sharp metal scent of snow melting from someone's boot sole near the radiator. Facts steadied her. Callum told the publicist to remove any reference to prior strategic authorship from the company history section because the weekend needed to feel clean. Odette tilted her head and said old histories made a wedding feel crowded. No one laughed loudly, but several people smiled because power had smiled first. Aurelia did not. The estate director slid a vellum approval packet across the walnut table, its top page embossed with Ravenhill's gray crest and 3 review labels in the lower margin: Heritage Venue Priority Option, Ceremonial Reputation Index, and Preservation Escrow Clearance. Callum barely looked at them before reaching for a Mont Blanc pen from his coat pocket, the same black pen he used for televised acquisitions and charity pledges. He signed the preliminary event acknowledgement with a flourish meant to be photographed. The only sound was the dry scrape of the nib crossing vellum. Odette leaned closer to see her chosen chapel marked in blue, her perfume drifting sweetly over the table like something trying to cover smoke. Callum placed the pen down and told the room that Ravenhill would mark a graceful transition. The words found Aurelia across the room. She held his gaze. Outside, wind pushed snow against the glass, and far below, city lights flickered as if the towers themselves were blinking through ice. Inside, the chandelier made Callum look golden and untouchable, but Aurelia had spent 15 years learning that gold leaf was not structure. Structure was priority rights, escrow triggers, restricted use, private filings, and the silent movement of capital before pride knew it had been outpaced. The assistant offered Aurelia the packet for a witness notation, not a decision signature. That small insult arrived dressed as procedure. She accepted the pen. Then, instead of signing, she turned to the margin and read the preservation labels twice, slowly enough for the estate director to notice. Callum's smile stayed in place, but the warmth left it. Odette's fingers stopped moving over the vellum map. At 10:27, the old chapel key in the shadow box gave a faint metallic tick as the heated room expanded around it. Aurelia heard it clearly. The key was not decorative. The land was not simple. The ceremony was not secured. She returned the pen uncapped, untouched, and said, "Noted." Callum gave a small laugh for the room, but the laughter had to travel farther than usual to sound confident. Aurelia stepped back into the corner shadow as the chandelier burned above him, and in that split-screen silence, the future began changing owners. At 11:03, the snow turned heavier over Ravenhill, softening the carriage road until the black vehicles outside looked like ink stains sinking into white paper. Inside the estate library, firelight moved over carved shelves, leather-bound land records, and the glass case holding the old chapel key, while Callum stood beneath a brass reading lamp with Odette beside him, both framed by warm light, as if the room had already chosen them for a portrait. Aurelia stood in the far corner near the dark window, where the reflection of Albany's distant high-rises flickered below the mountain like a second city trapped under ice. She remained still. The split screen was exact, Callum smiling under the lamp, Odette touching the cream sleeve of his coat, Aurelia silent in the shadow with snowlight resting on one side of her face. He told her in a low, polished voice that the weekend mattered too much for private emotion, and that her attendance would show the press a modern, graceful transition. The phrase was shaped like courtesy, but it carried the weight of dismissal. Aurelia looked at the vellum map on the reading table. Callum reminded her that Drace Holdings had already absorbed the venue deposit, the media placements, and the $612,000 publicity package tied to Ravenhill's exclusive winter reveal. He spoke as though numbers could turn humiliation into policy. Odette smiled toward the window, pretending not to listen. Her pulse stayed calm because facts had always been kinder to her than people. She touched the notation once. Callum mistook her silence for surrender and gave Odette a quick, amused glance, the kind meant to make another person feel included in a private victory. Under the brass lamp, his smile warmed. In the dark glass, Aurelia's reflection sharpened. That was the whole marriage. Odette asked if Aurelia wanted a separate entrance on the ceremony day, a voice soft enough to be deniable and cruel enough to be understood. Callum did not correct her. The estate director lowered his eyes to the floor. Aurelia removed her wedding ring at 11:11, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the careful patience of someone closing a ledger. The only sound was the soft, final tap of gold against the waxed Ravenhill map. She placed it directly over the chapel symbol, where Odette had planned to stand beneath flowers and cameras. Then Aurelia opened the slim black folder she had carried all morning and took out a single cream card embossed with the name Maeve Ellison, Preservation Council, North Pearl Street, Albany. Callum frowned for the first time. Odette's smile faded by half an inch. Aurelia did not explain the heritage venue priority option, or the silent preservation transfer addendum, or the ceremonial use revocation rider waiting inside Ravenhill's old ownership file. She did not tell Callum that restricted use estates did not always belong to the person who paid the loudest deposit. She simply closed the folder and looked at him as the city lights trembled far below through the snow. "Revenge is noisy," she said quietly. Callum's face tightened under the lamp. Aurelia picked up her gloves, left the ring on the map, and walked toward the library doors without looking back. At the threshold, with the fire behind him and the winter dark beside her, she finished the sentence. "This is consequence." The old chapel key ticked once in its glass case. By 11:14, Aurelia was outside in the falling snow, stepping into the cold air with no tears, no raised voice, and no audience worth keeping. Behind the library window, Callum still stood in the golden room with Odette beside him, but the estate around them had already begun to feel less like a venue and more like a locked door. At 12:06, Aurelia's Blacktown car descended from Ravenhill through a white curtain of mountain snow, the tires whispering over salted switchbacks while the estate disappeared behind her like a sentence finally ended. By 1:18, she was inside Maeve Ellison's narrow preservation office on North Pearl Street in Albany, 7 floors above the street, where rain had replaced snow and city lights glowed through wet glass in pale yellow rose. The room smelled of coffee, old plaster, toner ink, and the faint mineral cold rising from the Hudson 3 blocks east. Aurelia removed her gloves. Across the mountain, in Ravenhill's warm library, Callum stood under antique lamps with Odette near the fireplace, smiling at a revised media schedule as if a woman's exit were only a public relations delay. In Albany's gray afternoon, Aurelia sat in the darker corner of Maeve's office, still as winter stone, reading land records while the city shimmered below. The split screen had become sharper. Callum laughing beneath golden light, planning camera angles. Aurelia silent under rain-streaked glass, studying ownership angles. Only one of them was looking at the foundation. Maeve Ellison was 51, silver-haired, precise, and dressed in a navy suit that looked less expensive than Callum's, but far more dangerous. She placed 3 files on the table at 127, each bound with cotton tape and marked in pencil. Ravenhill Original Conveyance, Restricted Heritage Appendix, and Private Venue Use Chain. Maeve had owed Aurelia a quiet loyalty since 2016, when Aurelia's risk model exposed a predatory lending scheme targeting widowed homeowners in Schenectady before it became a headline. She did not waste words. There's a seam. Aurelia opened the first file and saw the old Ravenhill boundary map, not the polished event version Odette had touched, but the legal survey showing easements, chapel protections, lake access, and a dormant purchase right tied to heritage stewardship. Callum had paid for a weekend, but the land was still wrapped in obligations older than his publicity team. The estate's owner could accept a deposit, but could not finalize ceremonial use while a heritage venue priority option remained unresolved. The difference was not emotional. It was fatal. Maeve slid the second file forward and tapped page 42 with one red-lacquered fingernail. There it was, Silent Preservation Transfer Addendum, a dormant pathway allowing a qualified cultural trust to acquire Ravenhill before private spectacle rights matured. Beneath it sat a narrower clause, almost invisible in the margin, called the Ceremonial Use Revocation Rider, triggered by reputational misuse, undisclosed image exploitation, or event narratives conflicting with heritage stewardship. Aurelia read it twice. Then she read it again. At Ravenhill, Callum was likely approving Odette's floral arch beneath warm lamps, amused by the thought that Aurelia had left without a fight. In Albany, Aurelia confirmed the 5 trustees, 3 funding sources, and the Ravenhill parcel number already waiting inside Maeve's encrypted closing portal. Rain tapped the office windows while the high-rises across State Street lit up one floor at a time, small electric squares rising against the early dark. Her reflection in the glass did not tremble. Maeve asked if she wanted the acquisition routed through an existing Drace vehicle for efficiency. Aurelia looked up slowly. No, that one word changed the architecture of the next 10 years. She used her own liquidity reserve, $18. $4 million from a private education trust she had built before her marriage became a brand, then added a $7 million preservation bond secured through a women-led municipal heritage fund. Maeve prepared the filing under Aurelia's restored maiden identity, Aurelia Vane, founding trustee, Vane House Foundation in formation. Morrow was the name the marriage had placed on her. Vane was the name that had built everything before it. The only sound was the clean click of Maeve's brass notary seal pressing into cream paper. Aurelia placed her thumb beside the embossed mark, feeling the raised edge of law where pain had tried to live. The old Ravenhill chapel key still hung behind glass miles away, but its meaning had moved. By 2:03, the transfer package was queued for priority review. By 2:11, the preservation escrow opened. By 2:19, the source stewardship reversion ledger flagged Drace Holdings venue software for authorship review. Callum had brought Odette to choose a wedding estate. Aurelia had begun taking back the system that made estates choosable. By 3:08, the rain over Albany had thickened into a silver sheet, blurring North Pearl Street until the traffic lights below Maeve's 7th-floor window looked like red and green coins dropped into water. Aurelia sat beneath the office's dim task lamp with her coat folded over the back of the chair, reviewing the final formation papers for Vane House Foundation while the city towers across the street began glowing floor by floor against the winter dusk. 38 miles northwest, Ravenhill's reception room was warm with chandelier light, imported candles, and Callum's practiced laugh as he told Odette that everything was back on schedule. Aurelia signed nothing carelessly. The split screen was merciless, Callum smiling under golden lamps, raising a glass of sparkling water beside Odette's cream silk sleeve. Aurelia still in a darker office corner. choosing clauses sharp enough to outlive applause. Maeve placed a fresh sheet before her, titled Founding Capital Misuse Trigger, and explained that Drace Holdings had routed preliminary venue funds through an internal legacy asset account originally built from Aurelia's premarital models. The account held $31.2 million in dormant strategic reserves, but its use was restricted by authorship, stewardship purpose, and reputational alignment. Callum had treated it as a private drawer. The drawer had teeth. At Ravenhill, Odette was likely selecting candle heights, linen tones, and the angle from which photographers would catch her walking toward the chapel doors. In Albany, Aurelia examined the digital audit trail showing who approved the payment, who removed her name from the internal strategy record, and who relabeled her models as Executive Heritage Intuition. The phrase almost made Maeve smile. Aurelia did not. At 3:22, Maeve opened a second secure screen tied to the Source Stewardship Reversion Ledger, the authorship registry Aurelia had created years earlier to protect estate analytics, risk scoring, municipal incentive mapping, and preservation use forecasting. Each module had been built under her maiden research files, long before Callum learned to repeat her language at investor dinners. He had used her system to book the venue where he planned to replace her. That was not romance. That was misuse. Rain clicked against the glass like 1,000 small signatures while the Bank of America Tower lights shimmered through the fog beyond State Street. Aurelia authorized the ledger review, the preservation escrow, and the first release of funds to Vanehouse Foundation, not as a vanity project, but as a shield for women whose labor had been polished into someone else's legacy. The Foundation's first program would cover legal audits, asset tracing, IP recovery, safe housing retainers, and emergency education grants for women leaving financially controlled marriages. Maeve asked what public mission language she wanted. Aurelia looked at the Ravenhill parcel number on the screen. Give them ownership. The only sound was the firm snap of the steel binder clip closing over the Foundation charter. At 3:41, the priority acquisition packet transmitted to the Preservation Board. At 3:49, the $18.4 million private reserve cleared. At 4:06, the $6.7 million heritage bond was accepted, and at 4:18, the pre-cleared silent preservation transfer addendum moved Ravenhill out of reach before Callum's evening toast had even begun, because Aurelia had quietly secured the priority path months before he brought Odette to the estate. Maeve printed one confirmation page on thick ivory paper, and the machine's low hum filled the office like a verdict being born. Aurelia watched the ink settle into her maiden name, Aurelia Vane. Far away, Callum stood in light, still believing the room belonged to him, still making Odette laugh beneath a chandelier, still mistaking brightness for control. In the dark glass of Maeve's office, Aurelia's reflection looked calm, complete, and unreachable. She picked up the confirmation, folded it once, and placed it beside the old chapel key notation. Ravenhill was no longer a venue. It was evidence. At 5:02, Ravenhill Winter Estate glowed like a snow globe built for wealthy people who feared silence. Its chapel windows amber, its conservatory glass bright, its frozen lake reflecting portable event lights in long trembling bars. Callum stood in the east reception room beneath the chandelier, smiling at Odette, while a planner adjusted the final ceremony board and a florist from Manhattan confirmed 2,400 white camellias for Saturday morning delivery. Outside, snow moved sideways across the mountain road, and far beyond the ridge, Albany's high-rise lights flickered through the storm like a city trying to stay warm under glass. He raised his glass. The split screen could not have been colder. Callum laughing under gold lamps, his Brioni cuffs clean and his public face rehearsed. Aurelia seated miles away in Maeve's darkening Albany office, silent beside rain-streaked windows and the ivory confirmation page that now carried Ravenhill's future. At 5:09, the first warning arrived on the event planner's tablet, a red-bordered notice from the Preservation Board referencing the ceremonial use revocation rider and pending stewardship review. The planner stared at it for 6 full seconds before turning the screen toward Callum. Odette's smile held, but only because she had not read the second line. The room lost its music. Callum took the tablet with the casual arrogance of a man used to problems shrinking when he touched them, then frowned when the venue calendar changed from exclusive hold to restricted access pending ownership update. He asked who had authorized the change, and the estate director answered with careful legal softness that Ravenhill's used chain had been superseded by a qualified preservation transfer. Callum laughed once, too lightly. That's impossible. At 5:14, the estate director received written clearance from the new stewardship authority, crossed the stone corridor, and disabled the chapel access himself with a clean mechanical turn. The only sound was the cold click of the chapel lock settling into place. Odette walked toward the courtyard doors, her cream silk dress catching candlelight, and told the staff that someone should simply open it for the rehearsal. No one moved. The estate director explained that the chapel key could no longer be released without written clearance from Vanehouse Foundation, and that all ceremonial imaging rights were frozen under the Heritage Venue Priority Option review. Callum's face stayed polished, but his hand tightened around the tablet. Across the storm-dark valley, office towers blinked beyond the snow, while inside Maeve's office, Aurelia watched a secure dashboard update at 5:18. Ravenhill access suspended, escrow acknowledged, venue use permissions revoked. She did not celebrate. She exhaled once. At Ravenhill, the florist called her regional manager, the caterer paused the $92,000 tasting schedule, and the security vendor asked whether the media vans should be turned around at the lower gate on County Route 16. Odette demanded a private room. Callum demanded the owner. The estate director looked at the printed transfer notice and said the owner was no longer available through Drace Holdings channels. That sentence did more damage than a headline. At 5:27, a second alert struck Callum's phone. Drace Holdings' legacy asset platform had been placed under authorship review through the source stewardship reversion ledger. 3 investor contacts followed within 2 minutes. Then a message from Hartwell Private Capital asking for clarification on the founding capital misuse trigger tied to Ravenhill payments. Callum looked toward Odette, but she was no longer looking at him as a savior. She was looking at him as a failed arrangement. In Albany, Aurelia sat in the corner shadow with the skyline behind her, calm enough to seem distant from the ruin and precise enough to have caused it. Maeve placed a cup of black coffee beside her and said the board had accepted the preservation priority. Aurelia nodded. Proceed. At Ravenhill, the chandeliers still made Callum look expensive, but not powerful, and Odette's silk no longer looked bridal, only fragile under too much light. The final blow came at 5:36, when the media platform permit was formally withdrawn and the estate's projected layout vanished from the planner's wall. The only sound was the soft thud of the printed ceremony board sliding off its easel onto the polished floor. Callum stared at the empty screen as if brightness had betrayed him. For the first time that day, no one waited for him to speak. At 6:08, Ravenhill's east reception room still glowed beneath its chandeliers, but the warmth had become theatrical, the kind of light that made polished surfaces look honest for a few seconds before the truth returned. Callum stood near the fallen ceremony board, forcing a small laugh as he told the planner that preservation offices were famous for overreacting, while Odette stood 6 feet away in cream silk, no longer beside him, but angled toward the door. Outside, snow swept across the frozen lake in hard white lines, and far below the mountain, Albany's high-rise windows shone through the storm like distant rooms where other people still had order. Aurelia watched the stewardship dashboard update in measured silence. The split screen was merciless again, Callum laughing beneath antique light, performing control for staff who had stopped believing him. Aurelia sitting in Maeve's dim Albany office, silent in the corner shadow, reviewing each revoked permission like a ledger finally correcting itself. At 6:13, the first partner withdrew. Hartwell Private Capital sent a formal notice requesting immediate clarification of Drace Holdings' exposure under the founding capital misuse trigger, with a $72 million co-investment now paused pending stewardship verification. Callum read the message twice, then turned the phone face down as if darkness could bury it. It could not. At 6:17, the caterer canceled the custom dinner build-out because Ravenhill's kitchen access had been reclassified under the ceremonial use revocation rider, and the florist truck was stopped 8 miles below the estate gate on County Route 16. Odette's face changed first, not into grief, but calculation. She asked whether the event could move to Manhattan by Saturday. Callum looked at her. She did not look ashamed. The only sound was the brittle crack of the acrylic seating chart when a planner lifted it too quickly and one corner snapped clean off. The broken edge caught the chandelier light like ice. Callum told everyone to leave the room except Odette, but no one moved immediately because his authority had begun to require confirmation from people with smaller titles and better information. The estate director folded the transfer notice and kept it in his hand. Security spoke quietly into a radio near the hallway. Odette crossed her arms over the pale silk of her dress and said, "You promised me Ravenhill." That was when Callum understood she had not wanted him whole. She had wanted the stage. At 6:24, his phone lit again with messages from 2 board members, 1 family office, and a reporter from the Albany Business Review asking whether Drace Holdings had misrepresented control over restricted heritage assets. The word misrepresented was clean enough for print and sharp enough to cut credit lines. Rain streaked Maeve's office windows while snow buried Ravenhill's courtyard, 2 kinds of weather dividing 2 kinds of power. In Albany, Aurelia reviewed the Source Stewardship Reversion Ledger Summary, showing 7 platform modules now under authorship audit. Venue valuation, restricted use scoring, preservation escrow routing, reputational exposure analysis, municipal incentive mapping, legacy asset calendar access, and donor risk screening. Each one had begun as her work. Each one had been renamed after his brand. The ledger did not destroy Drace Holdings by itself. It simply forced every serious investor to ask who had built the machinery Callum had been selling as his own. At Ravenhill, Callum tried to call Aurelia at 6:31, but the call went unanswered after 4 rings. Odette saw the name on the screen and laughed softly, not with warmth, but with fear disguised as contempt. "So she owns the place?" Odette asked, as if the loss were only architectural. Callum said nothing. The question answered itself. At 6:39, the media team removed the Ravenhill images from the campaign folder, and every projected photograph on the wall disappeared into blank gray squares. The only sound was the low electric hum of the projector, showing nothing. Odette stepped out of the chandelier light and told her assistant to find a hotel suite in Manhattan, something less complicated, as if the disaster were a location issue and not a character issue. Callum watched her leave, the cream silk moving through the doorway like a promise withdrawing its signature. In Albany, Aurelia placed the ledger summary beside the Ravenhill confirmation page, both aligned with exact corners. Maeve asked if she wanted to release the full audit tonight. Aurelia looked out at the city lights burning through the rain and thought of the chapel key, the ring on the map, and the man still standing under lights that no longer warmed him. "Not tonight," she said. At Ravenhill, Callum remained in the bright room alone, surrounded by flowers that would never be delivered and cameras that would never roll. The Empire had not fallen loudly. It had simply stopped returning his calls. 5 years later, at 7:40 on a snowy November evening, Ravenhill Winter Estate no longer looked like a place built for someone else's performance. It looked like a place that had learned to tell the truth. The Greystone Chapel had been restored, the Winter Conservatory glowed with soft botanical light, and the frozen lake reflected rows of lanterns placed along the old carriage road at exact 12-foot intervals. Beyond the mountain, Albany's high-rise lights shimmered through drifting snow like distant constellations behind glass. Aurelia Vane arrived quietly. Inside the main hall, 300 women, founders, paralegals, shelter directors, legal fellows from Columbia, trustees from Chicago, and municipal finance directors from Boston, waited beneath a ceiling Callum once believed would frame his reinvention. Tonight, it framed hers. At the rear of the room, near the media riser, Callum Drace stood under a warm sponsor light with a careful smile, older by more than years, his navy Tom Ford suit still expensive, but no longer enough to command the air. In the darker aisle near the chapel arch, Aurelia stood still in a deep red wool dress, her hair swept back, her posture calm, her hands resting around a slim ivory folder embossed with Vanehouse Foundation. The split screen had returned. Callum smiling under lights built for donors, pretending ease beside men who now spoke around him. Aurelia silent in the shadowed stone arch, holding the institution his pride had accidentally helped her build. At 7:52, the annual report opened on the hall screen. $214 million in protected assets, 1,870 women served across 9 states, 312 intellectual property recoveries, 148 emergency housing placements, and 64 founder credit restorations completed through the source stewardship reversion ledger model. A low murmur moved through the audience. Aurelia did not look at Callum. The Foundation's newest program, the Founding Equity Restoration Protocol, was designed for women whose work had been hidden behind family offices, marital brands, and social respectability. The Ravenhill Training Wing now taught preservation finance, asset tracing, authorship defense, safe exit planning, and reputational risk navigation without turning pain into spectacle. The curriculum was precise. The mercy was practical. Maeve Ellison, now Vane House's general counsel, introduced the final exhibit at 8:03, the original Ravenhill vellum map, preserved behind museum glass, with Aurelia's old wedding ring still positioned over the chapel symbol where she had left it. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound was the soft click of the glass case locking over the map. Callum saw it from across the hall, and for the first time that night, his smile failed to return on schedule. He remembered the library, the brass lamp, Odette's cream silk, the snow, the ring, the sentence he had not understood until his empire began shrinking in boardrooms with polite coffee. Odette had left within 18 months. After the sponsor dinners dried up, the charity board stopped returning her calls, and the cameras no longer turned when she entered a room. Aurelia had not vanished. She had become infrastructure. At 8:16, she walked to the podium, not with triumph, but with ownership, while outside the storm pressed white against the windows and the city lights below trembled like witnesses refusing to leave. She spoke about women who had been called supportive when they were strategic, graceful when they were erased, difficult when they asked for credit, and lucky when they had built the table. Then she looked across the hall, past Callum's sponsor light, toward the dark glass where her own reflection stood clear. "A name is not decoration," she said. The applause rose slowly, then fully, not because she demanded it, but because the room understood the cost of silence becoming structure. Callum lowered his eyes as the report closed on the screen, and Vane House Foundation seal appeared in clean silver against black. The only sound was the crisp turn of Aurelia's ivory folder closing over the final page. Ravenhill was no longer evidence. It was legacy. At 8:47, after the applause had settled into a warm hush, Callum found Aurelia beside the chapel corridor where snow pressed against the arched windows and Albany's distant high-rise lights blinked far below the mountain like quiet witnesses. He stood beneath a soft donor light with his hands folded in front of his navy suit, the same posture he once used for boardrooms, magazine covers, and apologies that were really negotiations. Aurelia stood half in shadow near the old stone wall, holding the ivory Vane House folder against her side, her deep red dress calm against the winter dark. For once, he did not smile first. Callum said her name carefully, as if he had finally learned it was not a brand accessory, not a line in a family profile, not a signature to be moved beneath his. He told her he had spent years understanding the exact thing he refused to see at Ravenhill, that he had let Odette Fairborn choose the wedding venue because he believed the stage belonged to him, while Aurelia had already understood the estate, the land, the priority rights, the preservation escrow, the authorship ledger, and the quiet architecture beneath every public room he had ever entered. He said he was sorry for making her watch another woman select the chapel, the conservatory, the lake path, and the future he thought he could display over her silence. Aurelia listened without interrupting. Outside, snow slid down the glass in thin white trails, and the city lights below shimmered like coins beneath dark water. Callum admitted the truth at last. Odette had chosen the wedding venue, but Aurelia had bought the estate before the ceremony could turn humiliation into history. Not just to stop a ceremony, not just to embarrass him, and not to win back a man who had already made himself small. She bought Ravenhill before the ceremony because he had confused rented access with ownership, public attention with permanence, and a wife's restraint with emptiness. The old chapel key lay inside a small display case behind them now, no longer a decorative relic, but proof that Odette had chosen a venue Aurelia already knew how to own. The only sound was the clean turn of the chapel display lock closing after Maeve secured the exhibit. Callum looked toward the glass case, then back at Aurelia, and asked whether forgiveness meant there was still a door somewhere between them. His voice was lower than it had been 5 years earlier, stripped of the charming pressure that once made people agree before they thought. Aurelia felt no victory rise in her chest, only distance, clean and steady. She told him she forgave him because carrying his failure any longer would make her life smaller, and she had not built Vanehouse Foundation to live inside a room he left behind. She released Odette too, not as a gift, but because Spectacle had already charged her in full. Then Aurelia looked through the chapel window at the lanterns along the carriage road, each one placed 12 feet apart, each one glowing through the snow with patient certainty. She thought of the young women downstairs reviewing asset records, the founders recovering stolen credit, the mothers learning how to separate emergency funds from fear, and the quiet students touching legal language for the first time like a key they had always been told was not theirs. Some endings do not need ruin to feel complete. Some endings need a woman to stop explaining why she was never replaceable. Callum nodded slowly, and in that moment he seemed to understand that forgiveness was not a bridge back to comfort. It was a locked gate opened only for her own release. He had let his mistress choose the wedding venue, and Aurelia had bought the estate first, turning a planned humiliation into a permanent institution that would protect women long after his apology faded. She stepped past him toward the warm hall where her name, her work, and her future waited without needing his permission. When he whispered that he still loved her, she did not turn around. Aurelia's answer was calm, final, and free. The door is closed. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.